It began with the chilling words, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed, and it ended with what is thought to be one of the first recorded genocides. The words, often repeated by Cato the Censor, a Roman senator who brought new meaning to the words hawkish, frequently found their way into discussions on the Senate floor in Rome that preceded the Third Punic War, the grandstand finale to a trilogy that had spanned almost a century. They were used to galvanize a Roman empire that had toyed with the ailing Carthaginian empire without actually finishing it off. Senators were divided between those who saw the once mighty city of Carthage as now subordinate to Rome in every way and no longer a threat, and those who believed that only the city's complete destruction would placate Roman pride and thirst for revenge. The Third Punic War ended with the cataclysmic Battle of Carthage that saw a savagery that had rarely been seen before. It led to the near-complete extermination of the Punic people, who had once been one of the most powerful groups anywhere in the Mediterranean. As the once great city lay in ruin, it concluded a 3-year siege that had pushed the Romans to the very brink and consigned the name Carthage to history. The ancient and once glorious city of Carthage lay close to the modern city of Tunis in Tunisia. Founded by Phoenician settlers around 814 BC, the city eventually grew into one of the largest and most powerful in the entire Mediterranean. For around 200 years or so, the city was one of many countries under the control of the city-state Tyre, close to modern-day Beirut. But around 650 BC, with Tyre's power waning, Carthage emerged from the shadows as an independent city in its own right. With it came a clearly defined culture, often referred to as Punic, which is Latin for Phoenician. The city was initially ruled by kings before becoming a republic around 480 BC, and by that time, Carthage had already established itself as a supreme Mediterranean power, both in terms of its military and its trading routes. At its pinnacle, the Carthaginian Empire stretched the length of North Africa's coast and included most of the Mediterranean islands and much of southern Spain. The Carthaginians were known for their seafaring abilities and exploration, with ships venturing out into the Atlantic to explore the African coastal regions, perhaps going as far as the River Gambia, an extraordinary distance for the age. As Carthage's power and territory grew, they eventually came into conflict with one of the other major players of the day, the Greeks. For several hundred years, Greek colonies had been slowly expanding around the Mediterranean, but its power began to slowly ebb away, and successive military defeats to the Carthaginians and the Etruscans saw Greek territory shrink ever further. Around that same time, a small city-state emerged from under the yoke of the Etruscans, and around 500 BC, Rome appeared as an independent power in its own right. Almost immediately, a treaty was signed with the Carthaginians, more of a clear division of power and land than anything else, with Rome at this point little more than a tiny, insignificant speck to the rapidly expanding Carthaginian Empire. Carthage had been embroiled in several bloody conflicts over Sicily, then controlled by the Greeks during the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC, and despite plenty of success, the campaigns also saw failure at a significant cost. This period also saw Rome's power expand rapidly around mainland Italy, and in 264 BC, the two came into conflict for the first time. With Sicily so close to the Italian mainland, it was only a matter of time until Roman expansion arrived on the islands, which at the time was broadly under the control of Carthage, with the exception of the independent city-state of Syracuse. In 264 BC, the Romans managed to gain a foothold in Messana in the northeast, but soon their gaze cast further afield. The Romans formed an alliance with Syracuse and attacked the Carthaginian stronghold of Akragas on the southern coast, which they eventually gained control of. But this was just the start, and over the next 22 years, the two heavyweights traded blows, mostly at sea, but also in Corsica, Sardinia, and even northern Africa, close to Carthage itself. This was a protracted, bloody affair that saw both sides incur enormous losses. The First Punic War saw the largest naval battles the world had ever seen, and for a long time it appeared as if the conflict would end in a stalemate. However, things swung in Rome's favour just enough, and in 241 BC, Carthage sued for peace, and the First Punic War ended when the Treaty of Lutatius was signed, in which Carthage ceded Sicily to the Romans along with 3,200 talents of silver. It had been a chastening defeat for the once mighty Carthage, and one which lingered long in memory. Just over 20 years later, a man rose through the Carthaginian ranks who would go on to haunt Roman dreams for decades, and and whose name would still be uttered with reverence over 2,000 years later. The name Hannibal is etched in memory as one of history's great military commanders, yet while his exploits were certainly extraordinary, they unquestionably led to the downfall of Carthage just over 40 years after his death. Hannibal's military accomplishments are legendary, and his traverse of the Alps with war elephants during winter has long been held up as one of history's most daringly brilliant plans. The Second Punic War began when Hannibal, who was stationed in what is today modern Spain, seized the pro-Roman city of Saguntum, close to what is today Valencia, in 219 BC. Rome immediately declared war on Carthage, but few, if any, expected what came next. With northern Italy protected by the mighty Alps, most in Rome assumed that any invasion would come from the south via the sea, especially in winter. Hannibal defied expectations in the most dramatic way possible when he marched his army, numbering somewhere between 50 and 70,000 men, along with 38 war elephants, over the Alps and into the Roman heartland. As the general and his men arrived in northern Italy unexpectedly in late winter, they caught the Romans off guard, and Hannibal and his Gaulish allies began smashing their way through the Roman Empire with supreme ease. A large Roman army was annihilated in 217 BC, and it seemed only a matter of time until the city of Rome itself fell into Carthaginian hands. Yet how and why Hannibal failed to take Rome is one of the great curiosities of history. His 17 years in Italy saw numerous significant victories, but this was always met with yet more Roman soldiers conscripted, and the Roman Empire just about held on, often liberating cities that had fallen to Hannibal after his army had left. In 203 BC, the Romans struck back, and an invasion force sailed from Italy to the doors of Carthage, and Hannibal was quickly recalled to defend the homeland. The Battle of Zama in 202 BC saw the Romans rout Hannibal's army, and a peace treaty was finally signed. If the conditions at the end of the First Punic War had been harsh, the conclusion of the Second went even further, with Carthage agreeing to pay an indemnity of 10,000 silver talents to be paid over 50 years, while the city was prohibited from owning war elephants and its fleet was restricted to 10 warships. Along with this, Carthage agreed not to wage war outside of Africa and only in Africa with Rome's consent. It was a brutal set of conditions that all but ended Carthage's role as a major player in the Mediterranean. As the years rolled past, Carthage paid off its debt much faster than expected, but remained little threat to Rome. But memories have a habit of lasting, and the devastation handed out by Hannibal on the mainland lingered darkly in the back of many Roman minds. Many in the Roman Senate were itching for final revenge over the Carthaginians, but with its once mighty empire now shriveled to all but the city of Carthage, it represented only a minor threat to the booming Roman Empire. But ancient Rome, with its complex web of intrigue, paranoia, and outright backstabbing, was far from a settled place, and the incessant calls by some in the Senate, including Cato the Censor, who would finish every speech on the subject of Carthage with the ominous words, "Carthage must be destroyed," urged Rome to finish the job once and for all. It didn't help that on a diplomatic visit to Carthage in 152 BC, Cato was shocked at the apparent wealth and prosperity in a city that Rome had brought to its knees just 50 years before. Rome had prevailed during both Punic Wars, but at a considerable cost. Like two grizzled heavyweights in the boxing ring, Rome and Carthage had bled each other dry over nearly a century, and while a thirst for revenge was still alive and well, there seemed to have been enough cool heads to prevent a further conflict, for a short time anyway. Part of the settlement at the end of the Second Punic War was that Carthage was prohibited from waging war without the express consent of the Romans. So, when neighboring Numidia, an ally of Rome, decided to annex land from Carthage in 149 BC, the Carthaginians sent an army to defend their lands. Whether this was intentionally engineered by the Romans as an excuse to finally invade Carthage, we don't know, but they absolutely jumped at the opportunity. An army of roughly 50,000 men arrived on the shores of Carthage, and the Romans set out their demands, which included the surrender of all armaments. No doubt looking to spare their city, the Carthaginians complied, and 200,000 sets of armor, 2,000 catapults, and a large number of warships were confiscated or destroyed. That wasn't it. The next set of demands called for a complete destruction of the city and the relocation of its entire population at least 16 kilometers, 10 miles from the sea. Across the entire span of recorded history, rarely have we seen such a list of prerequisites prior to surrender. Understandably, the Carthaginians balked at such demands, broke off negotiations, began rearming at a frantic pace, and prepared for war. Now, before we move on to the battle itself, it's worth setting the scene here. Carthage at the time had a population of 700,000, much larger than normal, because it was accommodating those from outside the city who were looking for protection against the Romans. It's thought that 140,000 Carthaginian women and children were evacuated from the city by the sea, which means that at least 500,000 remained inside as the siege began. The city had a wall that measured approximately 35 kilometers, 20 miles in circumference, that wrapped around its entirety. Carthage was situated on a small peninsula surrounded on three sides by water, a fact that made invasion considerably harder. To make things even worse for the Romans, the main approach by land was faced with not one wall, but three, which included a brick-built wall 9 meters wide and 15 to 20 meters high, with a 20-meter wide ditch in front of it. This section included a barracks capable of holding 24,000 soldiers and represented a fearsome defensive proposition. But this would not simply be a battle with the Romans on one side of the wall and the Carthaginians on the other. Carthage had raised a field army of roughly 30,000 men, led by Hasdrubal the Bothar, which was based at Nepharis, 25 kilometers south of the city. The attack on Carthage began shortly after negotiations broke down, but any notion that this would be a quick victory quickly evaporated. When the Romans had landed, they initially split their forces in two, with one assigned to each of the Roman consuls who had travelled with the legions, Manius Manilius and Lucius Marcius Censorinus. Manius Manilius positioned his men on a small strip of land that led directly to the city, while Lucius Marcius Censorinus and his men settled on the shore of Lake Tunis opposite the western wall of Carthage. The attack plan called for Manilius's men to fill the ditch facing the southern wall, then attack and scale it from there. The pincer would be completed by Censorinus, who would attack the western wall and scale it by using ladders. As the final preparations were made, the Romans made a fatal error. Both consuls assumed that the Carthaginians no longer possessed the kind of weaponry needed to repel an assault of this size, and both believed that the attack was little more than a foregone conclusion. Twice the Romans launched everything they had at the famed walls, and twice they were thrown back with a devastating loss of life. The Romans had constructed 2 giant battering rams, and one managed to breach a section of the wall, but as men clambered upward toward the hole, they met fierce resistance and quickly backtracked. Despite early Roman confidence, this would not be a quick victory. And so, the siege of Carthage began, with the 2 Roman groups camped outside the city, where their communication lines and foraging parties came under near constant attack from the Carthaginians. It remained this way for the best part of a year, with Rome struggling to break down the well-organized Carthaginians' defense. While the city had precious little groundwater available, it did have an extensive and highly sophisticated rainwater collection system that kept the city going, while supplies could still be brought in via the harbor. This period saw relentless assaults on the Roman army, often at night, which began to sap morale, and large-scale field fortifications were eventually built to stem the losses. In 148 BC, Roman elections saw 2 new consuls take power: Spurius Postumius Albinus Magnus and Calpurnius Piso, the latter of whom arrived outside Carthage later that year. Not to be outdone, Carthage also saw a dramatic change in leadership that saw Hasdrubal, commander of the Carthaginian field army, overthrow the civilian leadership in Carthage and assume full control himself. That year saw little progress for the Romans, and much of the frustration was said to be directed at Piso, whose military prowess was most certainly called into question. He was replaced the following year by a man whose name would linger over the ashes of Carthage: Scipio Aemilianus. Scipio was already in the fight as a tribune within the 4th Legion and had established himself as a savvy military leader. In 147 BC, he became consul despite being younger than the required age, and it was this change that unquestionably sped up the demise of Carthage. One of his first acts as consul was to lead a night attack that targeted a perceived weak spot in Carthage's walls. One of the city gates was seized, and 4,000 Roman soldiers poured forward as Carthaginian defenders struggled valiantly in the dark before falling back into the city. It's difficult to really break down a situation that happened in the middle of the night over 2,000 years ago, but Scipio decided his position would be untenable once the Carthaginians counterattacked during daylight and ordered his troops to retreat. Carthage had survived, but only by a whisker. In an act of furious retribution, Hasdrubal ordered that Roman survivors be tortured to death on the city walls in full view of the Roman army outside. Under Scipio's orders, the Romans tightened their siege around Carthage, but the Roman leader remained frustrated that ships could still slip through the cordon and into the city's harbour. In response, he ordered an enormous mole be constructed, a stone walkway that separates two bodies of water. There's a way of completely cutting off Carthage from the sea. But the Carthaginians too were busy constructing. 2 years earlier, they'd handed over their entire fleet to the Romans, but now they again began shipbuilding, a practice they had perfected long before Rome was even an empire. In the summer of 147 BC, 50 triremes and a number of smaller ships slipped through a gap in the Roman cordon, and suddenly the men from Italy once again had a fight on their hands. As fighting erupted, the Carthaginians more than held their own against the superior numbers of the Romans, but as they began to withdraw back toward the city, a collision caused a blockage, and many of the ships were either sunk or captured. The Carthaginians had failed to break the siege, but once again they delivered a vicious blow to the Romans. Ferocious fighting on the quayside eventually led to the Carthaginians ceding the area to the Romans, who took the opportunity to build an enormous brick wall as high as the city walls from where they could pour fire onto the city. Carthage was wobbling, and the final assault came from the harbour side, something which Hasdrubal had anticipated by ordering that all buildings in the area be completely destroyed. But it did little to slow down the Roman advance, and they soon smashed their way into Carthage's military harbour before pushing on into the city itself. Over the next 6 days, the Romans systematically worked their way through Carthage, burning every house to the ground and killing anybody they came into contact with. There isn't much recorded evidence about Carthaginian defense at this point, probably because it all comes from the Roman side, but we can only assume it collapsed into desperation as their once great city gradually went up in flames. The Romans took to moving from rooftop to rooftop to prevent missiles raining down on them, but as the days progressed, the remaining Carthaginian soldiers, which included some 900 Roman deserters, withdrew to the temple of Eshmoun in the center of the city. As the Romans closed in, the Carthaginians burnt the temple to the ground, an act of final belligerent desperation. It was only on the 7th day that Scipio decreed that prisoners could be taken, and it's thought that 50,000 Carthaginians were captured, all of whom were later sold into slavery. At this point, fact and myth began to merge, with Hasdrubal reportedly surrendering on condition of his safety. In response, as the story goes, his wife cursed his cowardly decision before jumping with their children into the raging fire. The destruction of Carthage was absolute, and Scipio spent 6 months methodically wrecking the once mighty city. There has long been a tale of how the Romans spread salt on the city as a way of cursing it or preventing it from ever being settled again, but this is almost certainly a more modern twist on the story. True or not, though, Carthage was razed to the ground and its people almost entirely wiped out. Considering what we know about the population of Carthage at the time and the evacuations that took place, it's likely that at least 500,000 people died, either during the 2-year siege or the city's final destruction. And the Romans didn't constrain themselves to just Carthage. 5 or 6 further African cities with Punic roots were completely destroyed as the Romans sought to extinguish not only Punic influence, but the Punic people themselves. What happened over 2,000 years ago just outside the modern city of Tunis is considered by some to be the first known genocide. In reality, it's very likely that another similar act must have occurred before, but perhaps not on the same scale. The destruction of Carthage signaled a bloody end to the Punic people who had once ruled the Mediterranean and heralded in another dominant empire who would rule supremely for nearly 500 years. So if you enjoyed today's story of a siege, I think you'd also enjoy another video that we've done, the Arab Siege of Constantinople, which I'm linking to on the screen now. Please check it out, give it a watch, you'll probably enjoy it, and thanks for watching.